So your coworker is watching us. Can he can see he can hear us both, right? If
Yes,
he
that's
still
right.
sees it.
So yeah, you're able to hear us both, right, Marcus? Yep. Okay. The thumbs up from him.
All right, so okay, now we're live. So now, Samuel, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. Sorry for all the technical difficulty stuff. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? Sorry for making you start your story over again. Please tell us about
Not a
yourself before we get
problem.
started.
Not a problem at all. Yeah. Like, once again, just a joy and pleasure to be here with you, Tom. And as I was mentioning earlier, I'm a fifth generation Christian coming from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. As I was just mentioning earlier, for those of you who are watching in the States, it is Wednesday noon in Malaysia already. So there was a bit of miscommunication on the timing as well. But as I mentioned, I'm a fifth generation Christian. And my great grandfather was a missionary from India to Malaysia, planted the Lutheran church in Malaysia. My grandfather was a church leader, and my father is a pastor. I was a pastor for some time as well before wanting to pursue Christian apologetics, by which I mean that I want to present a case for Christianity, but at the same time being very open to listen to the different views that are out there and to respond as meaningfully as possible. And that's really where I come into this, Tom.
Cool. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there are any reasons to believe in the existence of God. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? And then I'd like to hear or then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure, sounds great. Yeah, so first and foremost, I think that there's two things we talk about when we talk about coming to believe in God. Now, I didn't come to believe in God based on any evidence, and I think I need to put that out there because I think sometimes it can come across as very dishonest from Christians that we present the list of arguments as if this was what convinced us that Christianity was true, when in fact, I think for most of us, we just grew up in a Christian family, and that's why we've discovered that, I mean, we've come to believe that Christianity is true. And that was very much true of my journey as well, except at about the age of 16, I met someone who asked me questions about my own faith that I couldn't quite answer. And that's when, Tom, the intellectual pursuit began for me. So it was, as one theologian of the past says, faith seeking understanding. And with that said, so for me, the reason that I believe in God first and foremost is, as I mentioned, growing up in a Christian family, exposed to the Bible, believing everything it says. But having been facing the questions that I have out there, I've actually committed my life and say I want to pursue seminary studies. I want to take this on as a full-time job. Um, Today, if you ask me my position on why I believe in God, that has grown. And one of the most convincing things that convinced me about Christianity today, having already believed in it before that, was the argument for the resurrection. And actually, I'm not sure how many of your viewers have seen this, but actually, I've had the great opportunity of doing a debate with someone I really respect, and Paul Ants. It was, in fact, the second debate on modern day debate that he had moderated, the host of modern day debate, James. So, what I want to do is to present maybe the reasons why I believe uh, that the resurrection of Jesus is true, and if it's so, gave me added confidence, I should say. Not this, is not the reason why I believe Christianity is true, but gives me the confidence to say that I think Christianity is truer given these evidences. And for the most part, it's going to be the standard thing that you hear, right? Every time you hear the minimal facts argument, it's the standard four facts that people go with. But I have explored it, and just let me, for the sake of those who don't know, explain what those four facts are. The four facts is fact number one: Jesus was tried and crucified under the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. This is affirmed by folks even on the atheistic side, like Bart Ehrman, New Testament historian. And also that Jesus was, fact number two, buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea following his crucifixion, which leads to fact number three, that on the third day following his crucifixion, the women followers of Jesus discovered the empty tomb, leading to fact four, the disciples genuinely believed in the resurrection of Jesus, especially due to the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. So these are the standard four facts, Tom, that are out there that you will well be acquainted to. I know you've debated this time and time again. But one of the things I've tried to do, as I've mentioned to you earlier, is to seriously consider it's great, right? It's good to be in a church and present these four facts, and it'll be very convincing on surface. But what really shocked me, Tom, was that when I actually took these four facts and took it to the Gospels, I actually found that these four facts wouldn't even have convinced the disciples themselves. Think about it. The disciples, first and foremost, knew that Jesus had died. Number two, the disciples knew that Jesus was buried in Joseph's tomb. They knew on the third day that the women followers had discovered the empty tomb and had told them about it. And finally, they knew that some of their own fellow compatriots had already believed that Jesus had appeared to them. In fact, the two were, the two on the road to Emmaus, they've already met Jesus. Luke chapter 24 records that. But the others, the other 10, you could say, didn't quite believe yet. So, what startled me, Tom, is that you see, these four facts are being used to present a case, and if these four facts are true, therefore Christianity is true. But again, the disciples knew these four facts, they were eyewitnesses, and yet they didn't believe, they didn't come to the conclusion that Jesus had rose from the dead. So I began asking myself, if that's the case, then it's really a waste of time presenting these four facts. Granted, it won't even convince the disciples who lived with Jesus, mind you, because we are using this to try and convince people 2,000 years after the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, even though it would not have convinced the very friends of Jesus itself. So it seemed a bit unfair to get atheists to believe based on these reasons. And as I explored that and tried to be to have the intellectual integrity to actually see these things, what startled me was how Jesus actually convinced them that he had risen from the dead. According to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, Jesus appears to them, the post-mortem appearance of Jesus, and they still think it's a ghost. They go for every alternative except the resurrection. And that's quite simple because the Jewish mind, resurrection only begins on the last day. So for them, they were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. What Jesus did to convince them is he told them in Luke chapter 24, verses 44 onwards, he says, "This is what I told you while I was still with you, that what was written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms had to be fulfilled." And it says that he began to show them how these things were already prophesied, and what they were seeing and witnessing was in fact the manifestation of those things. So if you're going to ask me, Tom, one of the reasons, why do I believe Christianity is true? I was blown away by what the Old Testament predicted about a coming Jesus. Now, I've heard the objections to them, but you will notice that I'm approaching the resurrection very differently from how some of my own apologist friends would approach the argument for the resurrection. So when I look at this and I look through the Old Testament, I look through, I mean, this is a book written by a good 20 to 30 different authors, the Old Testament. The New Testament, of course, there are more. But the Old Testament is written by a good 20 to 30 different authors, and you find a consistent message. And just let me give a little bit of a background. You find in Genesis chapter 1, God creating man, Adam and Eve. This is the first book, first chapter of the Bible. And you find in Genesis chapter 3, sin comes into the world. Immediately in Genesis 3, verse 15, that same chapter, God promises a savior. Genesis 3:15 says, God speaking to Satan, "I'll create enmity between you and your offspring, between the woman and her seed, and he, the seed of the woman, will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Now, strike his heel seems to be a euphemism for slow, painful death, being struck on the heel by a serpent. And to be crushed on the head is to signify, I mean, ultimate defeat. So it seems as if the serpent would strike the heel of the seed of the woman, which is really strange because the Jewish rabbis translated the word seed as spermatos. I don't think that needs any explaining. So women don't have spermatos, and it seems to imply a virgin birth right there. That's debatable, but I'll just put it out there. This is what I found. That the seed of the woman, arguably the virgin born seed of the woman, is going to crush the head of the serpent, and he's going to do that through a slow, painful death. Now, Tom, this is the first three chapters of the book of Genesis. And if you go to Genesis 4, you find already Cain and Abel offering a sacrifice, God picking the sacrifice of the lamb. It's right there. You go further up to Genesis, further down, you go to Abraham. God is asking Abraham, "Give me a sacrifice." And and Abraham he's told to sacrifice his son. He's journeying up. God told him to travel 3 days to this particular mount called Mount Moriah, where he's going to have to offer Isaac up. And Isaac is down there down with the father carrying the firewood, little knowing that he was going to be the sacrifice. He's asking his father with his naivety, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham, the man of faith that he was, says, God is going to provide the sacrifice. Isaac carries the wood that is going to actually burn him up that hill. And God says, don't harm the boy. God shows them a ram, and that basically becomes the substitute for Isaac. Now, it's interesting that Mount Moriah today is where Jerusalem is built, and Jesus, 2,000 years later, as a Christian would believe, God sent his only son to die on that identical mountain. Now, what's remarkable about this is all this is just the first book of the Bible. And as you progress on, you go to the book of Exodus, you see about the Passover, a popular Jewish feast that is celebrated till this day, where the blood of the lamb is basically what causes the angel of death to pass away. You go through all of that in the Old Testament. Leading up to this, one thing I saw is this: the expectation of a coming Messiah who is going to die for the sins of the world, and the promise of redemption that will come through him is a consistent theme of the book of the Old Testament, right from the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Malachi. And when I took that and I saw that, Tom, what I realized here is this is the hand of God at work. Now, I know I don't expect my atheist friends to go, well, that's true, but this is why I've come to believe and, in fact, have my own faith anchored in that. It is not so much of the evidences, those evidences are good, but for me, what really shook me was the fact that all these were pointing up to the coming Christ. Now, I haven't gone into too much detail, and I'll hope that we have a back and forth dialogue on this. But this is one of those things that convinced me that if the Old Testament is predicting something, and this we can know for a fact existed hundreds of years before Jesus came, then either Jesus is a mythological figure that was made up, concocted to fit the evidence, and this is a view that some of them take, or maybe Jesus did indeed fulfill them, and this becomes one of the strong evidences that Jesus is the anticipated, predicted Messiah who is going to come. Now, I've come to the latter, as you very well can see, but then you supplement with the other evidences that are there: the evidence of Jesus' death, the evidence of his burial in Joseph's tomb, the evidence of Jesus's empty tomb, which was important for Christianity to spread in Jerusalem, and then the genuine belief of the disciples who were eyewitnesses of these very things. When you put all these together with the biblical testimony, I think you have a pretty compelling case for that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead, and that it's not just that these things were already predicted, and that you see the hand of God bringing one consistent message about a coming Messiah through whom the world will finally be able to have relationship with him. Now, I know this, to an atheist mind, I can imagine this is going to come across as a really absurd claim, but I really look forward to what I've just pretty much done here is to share with you why I genuinely believe this, and hope to hear from you as well, Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks for telling me your story. I'm glad you shared it with me. Yeah, so there's a few things you said that I really liked, like when you said that most Christians believe not because of the evidence, but because of they were brought up or their emotional reasons. I mean, I think that's true of atheists too. Like for me, I didn't stop believing in God because the arguments compelled me. I stopped believing because my prayers weren't answered. So for me, it's the same thing. It's more of an emotional thing, but I'm interested in the arguments. I find them fascinating. And the first argument you brought up
Likewise.
was the historicity of the Bible. My position on the historicity is that I can grant Jesus existed, I can grant he was crucified and that he had a tomb. The parts that I don't grant are the miracle stuff. So, like, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable for you to believe. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable for you to believe. And the difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis, meaning they have lots of things. There are lots of things about dogs that we can verify scientifically, like their DNA, their chemical composition, their bone structure, what they're allergic to, how to train them. And none of that stuff exists for unicorns. Unicorns don't have that explicit empirical basis. So the only evidence for the unicorn is essentially my say so, my testimony. And that isn't good enough. The reason it's reasonable to believe the dog is because it has my testimony plus that empirical basis behind it of the things that we can verify. And because we don't have both of those for the unicorn, it's not reasonable to believe in unicorns. And this leads to the principle that it's never reasonable to believe something based on testimony if it doesn't have an empirical basis, which means it wouldn't be reasonable to believe miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs based on testimony. And history is a kind of testimony. So then that's why most historians and biblical scholars today hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. Because they don't have that empirical basis and you only have the testimony, it's not reasonable to believe those things are real, just like it wouldn't be reasonable to believe in UFOs or magic because it's mentioned in the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so I grant that Jesus existed and that he was crucified and that he had a tomb, but I'm not sure it's reasonable to believe that he resurrected based off the testimony in the Bible.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, would you like me to respond to
Oh,
what
yeah,
you
go
said?
ahead. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. So now I find it really interesting because I didn't know that part about you, Tom, that that you had, for example, abandoned faith due to emotional reasons, as you said. Now that I don't think it's a bad thing, because you can come to truth for a variety of different reasons. But that doesn't mean that how you came to it, therefore proves your beliefs to be false. That's committing the genetic fallacy. And thank you for that honesty as well. So when you speak of the empirical basis, I do realize that this was part of a conversation that I noticed you had with inspiring philosophy as well. That went quite long back and forth on this one point. And I simply grant that that there are many things, including empiricism itself as a philosophical principle, that it hinges upon other philosophical premises in order to hold true. For example, that you need to believe that your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, or rather that your cognitive faculties are a reliable means of communicating truth to you before you can start believing your cognitive faculties and trusting whatever they say, right? So empiricism is the belief that that your cognitive faculty is reliable, and that's, for me, I think it's a reasonable assumption. So I'm not going to challenge that, but what I'm saying is that it hinges on a lot of things. So what I would say is I'm grateful that you've granted the facts as I've said, but if these things do hold true, I would agree with you. These are not empirical claims, but should we just then, based on the empirical principle, say, okay, well, we're not going to we're going to disregard all of it that is there? Um, I think that will be a bit much. I don't know, but I'm just thinking. So, and first, all I'm saying is number one, that the empirical basis itself relies heavily on other philosophical principles. And number two, with the approach that you've done, Tom, I think that you could be in danger of maybe eliminating a lot of good evidence that are out there. I'm just wondering if you think it would be a lot better to tackle the resurrection and to give a better, maybe maybe a better rebuttal as to why you think that the arguments don't work, rather than just simply based on that principle throughout the whole thing.
Right. So, from my perspective, I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a lot more philosophical baggage there other than what I just presented. It's grounded on a whole bunch of things like the laws of logic and the uniformity
Right.
of nature and the laws of physics and all those kinds of things. But just to go with the historicity right now, it seems that it's universally the case, as accepted in most academic circles, that testimony is not a reliable source for new things. Like if someone came to us tomorrow and said they saw a unicorn, no one would believe them. Like the only reason that would be reasonable to believe that a unicorn actually existed is if we had some empirical basis. Like if they brought a DNA sample, or they could actually show us the unicorn, or give us some way to pet it, or some kind of empirical way to verify the existence of the unicorn. No amount of testimony is reasonable to believe that. It doesn't matter if 500 people say it, or 5,000, or 5 million. Until we have the empirical basis, it's not reasonable to believe based on testimony alone. Because we have that. We have thousands of people saying that they've seen aliens, or thousands or tens of thousands of people saying they've seen Bigfoot, or hundreds of thousands saying they've seen magic, and millions saying they've seen homeopathy work, and hundreds of millions saying they've seen other kinds of magic and supernatural ghosts and astral projection, all that kind of stuff. And every
Right.
human being on the planet, if you show them a picture of an optical illusion, will see the optical illusion moving. So the fact that we see something, or that a certain number of people see something, isn't really evidence that it's there. We need something stronger. And that principle seems to hold universally, and I can apply that without losing anything in science, because science is based off that principle. So if I use this principle, the only things that we lose from history are miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs. Those are the only things I think we lose. I don't think we lose anything else. So what exactly would you? You said that we would lose some valuable evidence. What would you? Could you give an example of that?
Now, speaking mainly about the religious one that you've already covered, things like the existence of God and all that, and I think, Tom, a lot of it, just to go further than your question, of course, is a lot of it is just due to a worldview. Now, you come from the States, and I'm very much looking forward to come there myself one day. But over here in Asia, it's a completely different. worldview, from where we come from. So if you come and tell us things about, someone claimed they saw a ghost. In Asia, we have a saying, that uh, we either have seen a ghost ourselves or we know someone who has seen a ghost. This is the part of the world we come from, right? Where stories, and there are actually lots of people that go and visit what we call shamans and witch doctors and stuff like that. That is quite common, even in Malaysia, where I come from. So it's a lot of it has to do with worldview. So I guess to a Western mind that is rooted, I shouldn't say in empiricism, because I think, in a sense, I hold a lot to those things as well. But I should say in naturalism, the view that there is nothing beyond nature, just a simple layman definition. Uh, I think that we come from a different part of the world where we just don't quite see that, So if you come in, I've noticed sometimes that this is where I think sometimes a Christian from here could argue past an atheist, because an atheist would simply say, well, what about the miracles from other religions? Have you considered those too? And a Christian like myself would say, yeah, I mean, I have no problems affirming some of the miracles that happen on the other side. I mean, to me, they just don't come from God, So wherever they come from, I'm not going to go there. But I'm just saying that for the Christian like me, we can affirm those things because our worldview is shaped in such a way. But I guess in the West, it's a little bit different, as I'm hearing you explain that.
Well, in the West, we also have a lot of people who see mystics and spirituality and stuff. It's more the scientific community that avoids that. We have a lot of religious people in the West too, especially in the UK for homeopathy, big thing there. But so I'm not a naturalist in the fact that I don't say the natural world is all there is. There could absolutely be a supernatural. I'm open to that. I'm open to evidence of that. But from my position, it wouldn't be reasonable to believe in the supernatural just based off someone's testimony. I wouldn't believe there was actually a ghost just because someone said so. I mean, would you? Would you believe that there really was a ghost there just because one person said so?
Now, you see, I couldn't dismiss that it's not a ghost just because a person told me that. I cannot dismiss that, because that would be guilty of committing the genetic fallacy, right? To dismiss something just because it's one person's testimony. But I'd agree with you. There's not strong evidence to believe in such a statement. So I'll have to withhold belief, at least for myself. So I'll give you an example of this. I mean, the ghost one. Let me go to something that is a little bit more common. We hear a lot of Christians nowadays, or I mean, people of different religions as well, saying they know someone who died and came back to life again, and has this wonderful testimony of what they saw in the next life, and doctors can prove that this person been back from heaven, 30 minutes in heaven. I wouldn't believe those. Can i count that out and say that, for sure, I'm certain that it's utter nonsense? Maybe I don't know. For me, I'm just going to say I don't believe it. But until and unless I can maybe show why the belief is false, I'd have to suspend judgment on my part. And I think you kind of do that as well, if I understand you correctly.
Oh yeah,
But
absolutely. You're
yeah,
absolutely right.
so I mean, I'm just saying that I have to withhold thing, but it wouldn't just be false just because it is a personal testimony. So I think that when it comes to the resurrection, it's a little bit different, Tom, from the way you put it on, with regards to UFOs and all that. So I think there's a real possibility that UFOs could be there. I don't know. Haven't seen any
Oh,
yet,
I agree.
and
I
I'm
agree.
really
You're
open.
totally right. So when I say this, I'm not saying that they're false. I'm just saying the evidence of testimony isn't enough to make it reasonable to believe. It could be true, but you need more evidence.
Right. And when you said reasonable to believe, I'm assuming you're speaking of yourself, someone with your worldview, right?
Well, I would assume both of our real view, because you said like if someone claimed to have experienced a near-death experience, just that claim isn't enough. You need something stronger, right?
For me, yes.
Right. And I agree. I agree completely. So I think we have very similar worldview in that sense. In most of these cases, like if we apply it to magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, in all of those cases, we would both probably need something more than testimony to really believe that it's there, right?
Right, right. But for example, maybe just to add to that same example, if let's say the person I know for a long time has been a totally truthful person, an honest Abe, as probably someone from your side would say it, then in that case, I would have every reason to believe the person simply based on that person's reputation, that either this person believes such a thing or has been misled to believe such a thing. But I hope you see what I'm saying. It kind of depends where it's coming from
But
as
wait,
well.
wait a minute.
If I
But isn't that a genetic fallacy? Because now you're arguing that it's true because of where it came from.
No, I'm not arguing it is true based on where it came from. I'm simply saying it's more reasonable to me to believe in it, for me personally. So I'm making a personal statement here. For me, I would tend to be more inclined towards believing in someone if they came and told me, well, I've seen the spirit here, and if this person I know is an honest Abe, then the chances are I'll be more inclined to believe that person. It doesn't make it true or not. I'm not saying anything about the truth claim, but it's just talking about what would make it reasonable for me to believe personally.
Well, I would grant that it's reasonable to believe that that's what they saw because the human mind creates lots and lots of delusions. We see them every day. But I don't think it's reasonable to jump to the conclusion that what they're saying is actually true about the world. Like if they
I
say they
agree.
saw a ghost or a near death experience, to believe that that's actually what happened in the world, that would be a step too far. I don't think you could say that because that would be a genetic fallacy to say that because this person is trustworthy, therefore it's reasonable to believe that what they say actually corresponds to reality. That would be a genetic fallacy.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would agree with you for the most part, but I'm just wondering, with regards to your view on epistemology, for example, if a source comes from a reliable epistemic source, I know that doesn't apply to persons. Wouldn't you say that based on the reliability of the epistemic source, if it's warranted, that it is sufficient in the form of justification to believe such a thing?
Well, what do you mean by epistemic source? Because an epistemology is a theory of knowledge.
Take properly basic beliefs, for example, beliefs that the universe was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, those kind of things. If it comes from an epistemic source, namely the experience of the past, then I have every reason, I'm rational in basically holding that the universe, that, I mean, age is real, that my past experiences are real, right? Unless, of course, I can be proven to be delusional. So in that sense, I've got to trust my epistemic source, right? In the case of even what you said about empiricism, you are trusting your epistemic source, namely your cognitive faculties, your sense of touch, smell, sight, and all that. You'd have to trust those on the basis of which to form a justification that what you're seeing is actually what you're seeing, right?
Right. So by epistemic source, you mean a source of knowledge.
Yes, a source that
Okay.
produces
Okay.
knowledge.
So yeah. So
Yeah.
I use the terminology a little differently. So yes, you have to trust your epistemic source, but I think we can demonstrate that human beings are not a reliable epistemic source ever. They're just that's pretty unreliable. They're pretty.
That's, I mean, for the most part, I would agree with you, but although I wouldn't go so far as to make an absolute statement, but I think we're more or less in agreement.
Well, yeah. So I would say that we can know consistently that every single human being sees delusions. We know that every human mind is flawed in certain consistent ways, and so it's not reasonable to believe for certain kinds of things. It is for certain other things, but for certain things we know it is not reasonable to believe. For example, like usually we don't believe people's testimony about things that don't have an empirical basis. It's usually never reliable in that case. Like if someone says they saw Bigfoot, we will never find Bigfoot. If someone says they saw the Loch Ness monster, we never find the Loch Ness monster. If someone says they saw ghosts, we never find verification of ghosts or magic or supernatural or UFOs. Like those don't ever work. People make those claims a lot, they just don't ever work. So it's kind of like a delusion or an illusion, and we have like names for those: the anthropocentric or anthropomorphic fallacy. And so in those cases, the human mind is not a reliable epistemic source of knowledge. It's like a delusion. We don't trust the human mind when we look at delusions. We want to have some kind of a different epistemic source of knowledge that is reliable and verifiable.
Right. I mean, so far as you said, I'm almost in agreement with you. They're almost only because I think on some occasions that you can trust some things that people say, but I think that you've already conceded that, right? So, yeah.
But wouldn't you say that it's not reasonable that a human being's testimony is not a reliable epistemic source in the case of like miracles and magic and mythical creatures? You still need something more, right?
Yeah, I would agree. You still need something more, but I think we're in agreement in the sense that you can accept their testimony, but you wouldn't accept their testimony to mean that therefore whatever they claim exists. But you can
Right.
accept their testimony to mean that they genuinely believe that,
Oh, absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, we're in agreement. Yeah.
All right. So the next thing you brought up was the predictions of the Bible, prophecies of the
Yes.
Bible. So from my
Yeah.
perspective, the prophecies in the Bible are not specific enough. They're too vague. Like for example, if I made a prediction that there's a guy named Bob standing in that direction, you could like travel in that direction for a mile and not find Bob, and I could say, well, no, just keep going. Eventually you'll find him, and then eventually you'll find a Bob. Like I was right. And so because it wasn't very specific, it wasn't a really good prediction. And I kind of see the Bible predictions to be like that. They're really vague, and you can interpret them in a lot of different ways. Like for example, there wasn't a prediction in the Old Testament where a guy named Jesus will be born to Mary son of Joseph or brother of Joseph, and then at this date, and will be executed by Pilate at this time. It doesn't say that. It's all really vague, and so I can't. It's not really a strong prediction for me because it can be interpreted in so many different ways. It's like making a whole bunch of different predictions and just, oh well, this interpretation happens to be right. Kind of like the Bob example.
Right. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned dates there, and I thought that was really funny because I just did a talk recently on the book of Daniel, chapter 7, and also I'm going to be speaking on Daniel chapter 9 pretty soon. And I actually looked at that, and what really blew me away was that I do think, Tom, I know it's subject to disagreement, but I do think that it does go so far as to predict the exact year that Jesus would die. And I mean, I guess it'd be if I was in church, I would say, if you have your Bibles now, turn with me to Daniel chapter 9. But of course, I'm not going to do that here. But I'll just tell you, Daniel chapter 9 predicts that the Messiah would basically be cut off, or it says the anointed one, which is basically another way of saying Messiah, will be cut off uh, 70 weeks, or basically 70 times 70 years is what we understand from that to mean. So it says there in Daniel chapter 9 that from the command to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem, the command to rebuild Jerusalem to the cutting off of the anointed one will be 62 sevens and 7 sevens. Basically, if you put those years together, from the command to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, arguably in Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 1, that came from Artaxerxes, to the destruction of Jesus, it actually comes all the way up to 80 30 or 80 33, if I'm not mistaken. So that, for example, would be an example of time being actually quite specific with regards to time. I'm just wondering, have you looked at that before, or is it? Yeah, I'm just wondering if you. I mean, I'm assuming you're a former Christian. I may be wrong.
Yes, I'm a former Christian. I've read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, and I have looked at those dates, but it seems to me like you're interpreting more than what the text actually says. Because if we look at the
Mm.
time, the rebuilding of the church, do we really, or the rebuilding of the temple, do we really actually know what the exact date of the temple was? And are you interpreting those numbers correctly in the correct genealogical order? Because the rate of time measurement at that time period wasn't the same as it was today. And so if you look at the actual time period and the reference frame of what that time actually meant, there's lots of different ways to interpret it because there are lots of different calendars even at that time period. And so which one was it referring to? And could the one that you have picked just be a lucky guess? Because, for example, the Hindu the Bhagavad Gita predicts that the world will be 4.8 billion years old, and they got that like pretty much exactly right. The Earth is like 4 point something billion years old, but I don't think that's a prediction by Hinduism. I think it's just a lucky guess. So it seems to be the
Okay.
same kind of thing.
Right. So, but what I mean, they're mainly about at least two different. I mean, in terms of the conservative interpretation, as you very well know, there are about two different ways of measuring that. Number one is, like you said, by the Jewish measuring system, which would be 360 days a year, right? Because in the Jewish month, it's 30 days times 12, 360. If you go by that calculation, you would actually arrive in AD 33. Whereas if you go by the 77s, by 300, I mean a 365 and quarter day calculation as we have, it would come to 80 30. So actually both come to pretty much the exact time of Jesus' death, and those are two different schools of interpretation being applied there. So now my point in only saying that is that it tends to get quite specific, particularly I guess one of the ways to test this theory is to see whether Daniel's audience understood what he said, right? Because if Daniel was in Persia, and this was written during the Persian Empire, then the Persians should have known about this, and the Persians would have been able to keep records and know when Jesus was going to be born, right? And actually, surprisingly, we do find that. There was a group of the Persians called the magicians, recorded in the book of Daniel, that whom Daniel was the chief of. I can't remember, one of the archaeological sources that I found actually called Daniel Rub Mug, which means he's the head of the magicians. And he gives them this prediction that I just brought to you. He mentions in that prediction that Jesus is going to die. I mean, or that rather the anointed one, the Messiah, is going to die. He mentions in that prediction that in Daniel chapter 7 that he's going to be God, he's going to rule over the world. Daniel 7, verse 13 to 14, the Son of Man who rules over the world. And so there are three things that seems to be implied. Number one, he seems to be implied as a king. Number two, as God. Number three, that he will die. It's interesting that when Jesus was born, a group from Persia called the Magi traveled over to come to King Herod, and you're familiar with this, of course, Tom. They come to him and say, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We've come to worship him." Now, that seems vaguely odd, right? Why would you have a bunch of Persians coming all the way from wherever they came from to worship a newborn baby? That makes no sense whatsoever, unless they understood Daniel to be saying the same Messiah who's going to be killed is going to rule the world, and that they better pay him tribute, otherwise they stand in risk of being treated as his enemies. Now, that's, I'm speaking about their interpretation. So they come to him and they give him gold, which is a royal tribute to a king, uh, meaning we are your subjects, don't destroy us, kind of thing. Number two, they give him incense, which is what they would give their gods, meaning they understood him to be God. And number three, they give him myrrh, something that you would do for embalmment, kind of anticipating his death. So, Tom, when I put that together, basically what you said, I think there's at least some level of evidence within the text itself, internal evidence, if you like, that suggests that the Persians in Daniel's time understood that message to mean this, and that they traveled to Jerusalem at the right time to pay homage to the newborn king of the Jews. I'm not quite sure if this is a view that you've thought about or
Right.
something.
Yeah, absolutely, it has, and I'm a big fan of future testable predictions. So if the Bible made future testable predictions, that would absolutely be evidence. I would totally count that. I'd be very happy with that. But from my interpretation, that story I think is fabricated. There's a lot of stories in the Bible that seem to have no real empirical basis. For example, the one is the census, where the everyone was supposed to return to
Often,
their homes and there was going to be a
yeah.
census taken, and that seems to be totally made up. There's no evidence of that ever happening in any historical records, in any historical scholars anywhere across the world. No one's been able to find it. And so there's a lot of stories in the Bible that seem to be fabricated in order to try and fit the story after it happened, and they didn't really seem to have really occurred actually in reality. That's one of the ones that I think is fabricated, because I don't think there were these Persian guys who happened to come across Jesus in the middle of Nazareth or Bethlehem and give him gold, incense, and myrrh. I don't think that happened. I don't think that was real, and I think that's the consensus among historians at this time.
Right. I mean, yeah. So this again is a historical debate, and I'm not quite sure if I've actually prepared one. All I was just saying is that the internal evidence suggests that now, as you said, some may interpret that to be an after the fact justification. But remember what I said earlier, Tom. If the Matthew, who was recording this, as I mentioned, and you're familiar with the evidences that usually would be produced to support this case, was a disciple of Jesus and an eyewitness of his resurrection, then you have good indications right there that at least Matthew believed these things to be true. Right? You said that you cannot accept a personal testimony to be reliable in terms of giving you fact, but in this case, you have good evidence that Matthew believed this to be true. And if so, would you say that that would kind of dismiss the charge of him cooking up this after the fact justification?
Do you mean, like, I grant that Matthew believed it was true. I'm happy to grant that, but I don't like. There's many authors of Matthew. Matthew wasn't the author of Matthew. There's lots of authors of Matthew, and so I don't. I wouldn't say that that particular segment was authored by the Matthew who would specifically believe that all of this was true. I believe that was actually like a later addition by a
So,
secondary author or scribes, those kinds of things.
so you believe that Matthew was not written by Matthew and that it was written by someone else?
Right, it was written by
Or
a conglomeration of a bunch of different people. There are lots of additions and changes all throughout history up until the 1300s with all the monasteries and stuff. People were adding and changing stuff the entire time.
I mean, just out of curiosity, are you aware of any papyri or manuscript or fragment in which, I mean, which has the complete Gospel of Matthew that does not include Matthew chapter 1 and 2? Actually, Matthew, I should say Matthew 2 because this is where this is recorded.
I do not.
I'm just wondering.
I'd have to actually go through it and check for sure.
Right. The reason I asked that is because, to my knowledge, every manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew that we had, and I've personally had the joy of going to the UK last year to look up some of the manuscripts as well in the British Library, John Ryland's library in the University of Manchester. So this is not something I'm reading off the internet. This is something that I personally used to teach Greek, and I personally, took an interest in going and visiting some of these manuscripts myself to see these things. And what I would say is that, to my knowledge at least, and if I'm wrong, I hope someone in the comment section proves me wrong, is that there's no manuscript in which the Gospel of Matthew excludes Matthew chapter 2. This is unanimously there in all the manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of Matthew. So I would say that if Matthew did write this, all the evidence that we would suggest that he did believe this and that he did include this in. But I respect the fact that we beg to differ.
Well, yeah, as far as I know, did Matthew write any of Matthew? Wasn't it all transcribed by other people through word of mouth?
No, actually, early church tradition indicates that Matthew did write it. Now, of course, some people here would start laughing and say, "Wait a minute, early church tradition." Of course. Now, what I would think, and one of the things that I've done in my presentation of the New Testament is that emphasize that one of the, if, for most part, none of the gospel writers actually include their name. So the Gospel of Matthew did not come down as the Gospel of Matthew. That's because if you put your name behind those things, those documents were treated as anti-Roman propaganda. You run the risk of being lion food, for good reasons. The only guy who really had the courage to write his name behind all his letters was really the Apostle Paul, and he had a good reason. So Paul would say things like, "I, Paul, write this with my own hand," and the only reason he has the audacity to put his name is because he's a Roman citizen. He knows that there's only a list of things that could go wrong for him. Whereas the others who are not being Roman citizens, take the Gospel of John. John only goes so far as to say the disciple whom Jesus loved. So for me, one of the demarcations, Tom, of the genuine Gospels from the Gospels that were fabricated was, apart from the fact that all the genuine Gospels we find in the first century, the second thing is that the main thing, that demarcation, is that all the genuine Gospels don't have the names. They're actually very much just it comes without the name, because they expect the early church recipients to know who is writing it, because it usually comes by means of a reliable witness or a traveling companion of whoever is writing it. So the false gospels, if you like, usually have the names, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Paul, the Gospel of Barnabas. The genuine Gospels all don't have the names. In fact, it is early church tradition that gives them the name. And it's very interesting because, for example, we take the Gospel of Mark. The only reason we know it's the Gospel of Mark is because early church tradition. The only reason we know it's the Gospel of Luke is early church tradition. Think about it. Would they actually? Why would they say Mark wrote it? Why not say someone like Peter wrote it, someone more prominent? Because I think they wanted to stay genuine to the fact. So Matthew was not one of the more prominent apostles. Neither Mark was an unknown guy, pretty much, and so was Luke. But the reason they stated who wrote this is they wanted to stay faithful to the facts. I mean, again, this is one of my reasons for believing that Matthew wrote Matthew, and that we can trust early church tradition on that part at least.
Well, my understanding was essentially none of the apostles actually wrote any of the gospels. Most of the gospels were written by secondary sources like the P source and the Q source, and that Matthew and Luke plagiarized from John, and then they were written after one another in sequential order by other people, and it was all word of mouth for the most part. And most of the apostles were illiterate; they couldn't read or write anyway. So I'm not sure that I really take the Christian tradition seriously. I think most of it came from other sources, or like you said, traveling companions that weren't the apostles themselves.
I think that's an interesting point that you make, because I'm not sure if any New Testament scholar would agree with you on the point that you mentioned about Matthew taking from John. This was because the Gospel of Matthew was written very early, and John was one of the last Gospels to be
All right,
written.
yeah, I got that backwards. You're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that's not a problem. So, and about the Q source, actually, most New Testament scholars actually hold to Markan, what they call Markan priority, which means Mark was the first gospel to be written. They believe Matthew copied off Mark, as you kind of hinted there. Matthew takes from Mark, and Luke draws from Mark, but they claim that both Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be drawing from a Q source, as you pointed out there. So the Q source was not basically what was written by the apostles. It was some early tradition that was going on, but that seems to be one of the spaces that the apostles drew out from. So the Q source is kind of like the quotation marks of Jesus' sayings, the recorded quotes of Jesus, if you like. But no one really has found a Q document, right? So Quell in German just simply means source. There's evidence that this unknown source that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are drawing from are called Q, but no one has found Q source. People are saying that Matthew used Q source as a means of writing his gospel, and also relied on Mark's gospel, since actually Mark was actually Peter, as you said, the early apostles, some of them were illiterate. Arguably, Peter the fisherman may have been illiterate. We don't know, but that's possibly one of the reasons why, even in First Peter, Peter mentions that I'm writing this with Silas. Silas is like kind of mentioning that in First Peter chapter 5 verse 12, that Silas is helping him write this, and that's why Mark helps Peter with his gospel. So Peter tends to get people to write for him, but Matthew, the tax collector, seems to be quite familiar with at least whatever he's writing with, and he's able to write that. So I don't think he would have been appointed a tax collector, Tom, if he was not a literate person. So good internal evidence to suggest that Matthew did write that.
All right, absolutely. So I definitely think that they were a part of the stories, but again, I don't think that is credible reasons to believe that what they're believing is true. It's just they happen to believe it, which sure, I can grant that.
Fair enough.
So it
Fair
still
enough.
seems to me like these are really vague predictions. Like as far as I know, I've gone through. There's a list of like thousands of predictions the Old Testament has made. And I've gone through all the like the ones that are considered the best, and they all seem to be super vague. I can't find. You have to interpret it in a certain way to get the prediction. It's not like Jesus will be born at this date to this person and executed by this person at like if they said that, that would be really good evidence. Or there are some predictions like in the Revelations about predictions that will happen. Those if they happen, those would be good evidence. But there hasn't really been that in the Old Testament. It all seems to be really vague for me. Can you give me any other examples of things that you would say were really specific?
For me, the other one that seems to be quite specific would be Psalm 22. Psalm 22 basically begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? And it goes on to say, they pierce my hands and my feet, and also that they divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Now, Psalm 22, interesting thing for the most part. Now, granting that what we've already established in our discussion, Tom, that the New Testament authors predominantly believed in what they wrote in, at least Matthew did, and John did, because those were the disciples. If they believed it and they were including the statements that Jesus on the cross had his garments divided by the Roman soldiers, and that for example, that that he's basically pierced his hands and feet. That's what crucifixion was. Then it seems to be that David in Psalm 22 was alluding to Jesus, because David's hands and feet were never pierced. That never happened to David. David was the king of Israel. No one was dividing his clothes and garments among them. Rather, for a long time, what people have been saying is that this is a New Testament invention. They actually added the words there that didn't exist. It wasn't until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered near Nagama in Egypt. That's when basically people managed to go back and see that actually the Dead Sea Scrolls, which preceded, written in the first century, preceded the Gospels, arguably, actually contain these verses as well. So for the most part, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the scholarly consensus was that this was a made-up fact by the New Testament. It's only after that, when they discovered manuscript evidence, it proved the fact that this was Old Testament. But here's what's remarkable, Tom. It talks about the piercing of the hands and feet, even though this never happened to David. So as a reader, the reader is left to ask, who is this person that David is alluding to? What is going on here? And this is, again, I'm just talking about one of many prophecies. The other would be Isaiah 53, which says, he's wounded for our transgressions, he's bruised for our iniquities, the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. It talks about a suffering servant. And when you put this together, you've got to ask yourself the question, who is Isaiah alluding to? I agree, it's not very clear. And Psalm 22, who is David alluding to? When you put those together, I think you realize that those were actually spot-on predictions of what was happening on the cross of Jesus when Jesus actually cries out those words. So those would be examples that I find would be there as well, that would be quite close.
I'm not so sure I follow on that part because, for as far as I know, like uh, the bruises can refer to essentially anything. Like there are lots and lots of people, it happens all the time, and the piercing of the hands and the feet, the same thing. There are lots of different torture methods that involve that far predate any of those historical references. So that could be
Sure.
those could apply to many different cases. I think it's a stretch to say that this is actually a prediction of Jesus when it could so easily apply to like millions and millions of other cases throughout the time period from David and before to Jesus and after.
I would agree that it could apply, that one prophecy could, but notice what I'm saying, Tom, is when you take all these prophecies together, if there was the only one, then maybe perhaps I think you may have a case in hand. But all I'm saying is here, taken into consideration all of them together as a whole, there's only, I think I'm not sure if this was a scholarly research or not, but I've read this somewhere. Maybe you've heard it before. That there's only like 1 in 2 million people who could have fulfilled this, or something along those lines. The chances were very slim if you put all those prophecies together. Now, I'm not going to go with the thousand that you said it was. I don't think it's that many, but I think it's definitely I could find a lot of them, which would be at least about 20 good ones, at least 20 in the top of my mind that I could quote to right now. that kind of puts that kind of makes those predictions. And remember what we said about the book of Daniel. We've already spoken about Daniel. Coming back to Isaiah, Isaiah's one was quite interesting because chapter in Isaiah chapter 7, it talks about the virgin shall be with child and will give him the name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, the Jews and the rabbis would arguably say this has already been fulfilled in Isaiah chapter 8, right? This guy is born, it's fulfilled. In fact, Isaiah chapter 9 says, unto us a child is born, present tense, it's already happening. To us a son is given, past tense, it's already happened. But then it suddenly switches to future tense again, and the government will be upon his shoulders. I'm quoting Isaiah 9:6. And the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will rule on David, his father's throne, from that time on forever. And the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. And you see that Isaiah is already starting to talk about a coming God who is going to be born to the virgin. Now, that is not a New Testament invention. The Jewish rabbis translated Isaiah 7 as Parthenos, virgin. And
Right. Well, that
basically
was
what
that
you
was a
have here,
common claim back then to be claimed to be born of a virgin. It happened a lot. There was lots of people who claimed that.
sure, but now all I'm saying here is this: when you put that together and talk about a person who is going to be born of the virgin. Now, again, those things could easily be disputed. When you say that that's a miracle, born of the virgin. But my point is rather when you start putting these things together and you start following the argument of Isaiah, he's talking about a coming person who is going to be Messiah and who is going to be killed. That's the context of Isaiah 53. He's going to die for the sins of his people. Has there been, into your knowledge, anyone who has died for the people of Israel under the claim that he was dying to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament? I can't find one. In fact, this actually went against Jewish the understanding, because to them the Messiah is going to be a political Messiah, ruling Messiah. But the Isaiah concept of a dying Messiah is something that only uniquely was claimed by Jesus. So
Well,
I think that
I
there has.
well, I would disagree with that because there are thousands and thousands of people who were crucified, who were claimed to be messiahs, and who died for their supposed people. The Romans did that all the time. That happened incredibly all the time throughout history. That's always happened.
Could you give me an example of someone who was crucified by the Romans who actually claimed to be Messiah
Well, that's
prior
that's
to the crucifixion?
that happened all the time. There's lots of people who claim to be messiahs and healers and spiritual leaders throughout all of history, and they were crucified by the Romans all the time. They're just in nameless graves. No one knows about them because they just didn't happen to survive the textbooks. But that wasn't like a rare thing. It wasn't like he was the only person claiming this. There are lots of people claiming this.
Right. I mean, but I'm just saying, do you have a list of people who claim that? Because that would have been a big thing. I'm
What?
talking about, do you have any claims and like an individual, say Barabbas or something like that, who claimed this, who got killed for this in kind of like in fulfillment to his claim? You don't have that. Do you see my point? There's only one person who makes that unique claim
I
and goes all the way to that.
Well, yeah, I don't have them because they're all nameless graves. No one remembers them, but there are millions of those. I mean, they happen all the time, all throughout history, all over the world. People always claim to be the Messiah or the God who has risen, and they're always people in those kinds of situations who are poor and who have people following them. We have people today who claim to be the resurrected Jesus, and they're
Oh yes.
persecuted in their countries. I mean, it seems not reasonable to assume that he was the only person in Rome who claimed to be the Messiah and was crucified. I mean, I don't think the Romans just made up crucifixion for messiahs just for Jesus. I mean, this was just a commonplace thing that happened to the Romans. There's a guy who claims to be Messiah. Let's kill him. So I mean, I
No,
don't think it.
I'd agree with you. I think this. In fact, I found it quite hilarious. You mentioned a lot of people claiming to be Jesus today. So that's not a claim that was just unique back then. But you see, the difference is, Tom. What I'm saying is, when you put it together with what I've mentioned about Daniel 9 already, the year is mentioned, and all that. All I'm saying is, when you take it as a cumulative case, then you've got something just more than just a set of what people's eyewitness testimony. You've got something predictive going on. And I'm saying that those things ought to be taken seriously. I hope you see what I mean. I'm not saying that just because the disciples said it, let's all believe it and let's become Christian.
All
It's
right,
it's a
right,
little bit more
absolutely.
than that.
But
Yeah, yeah.
if we take everything you said, the strongest possible argument you made, and say that's right, it has to be somebody who lived and was killed between 30 and 33 A.D. It has to be if a Jew, has to be a person who claims to be the Messiah and who was claims to have been born of a virgin and was crucified by the Romans. Even if we accept all of that, that still applies to thousands and thousands of people, like just throughout all of Roman history, just those
I
years. I mean, there's lots and lots of people who claim to be born of a virgin, who claim to be the Messiah. Like all of that is really common stuff in that time period, and not just in Christianity or Judaism, but in other religions too. So I mean, even
no,
if we grant
I would
all of
agree.
that, go
Sorry,
ahead.
you were saying, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, all I was saying is that, and I would agree with you, but the claim simply is here that taken everything into account, right? So what you seem to, and I think for the most part, I actually am in complete agreement with you that you just take one or two of these things. This could apply to anyone. But remember, the scripture also says he has to be raised from the dead. Psalm 16. He will not let his holy one see decay. So when you put that now together into the equation, when you put together that he had to be a descendant of David, now, you can say that Matthew made that up because Matthew's genealogy, Matthew chapter 1 is a genealogy of Jesus from David. But then again, we've already established that Matthew believes in this. I hope you see what I'm saying. The case is actually quite coherent in and of itself. And when you start putting all these pieces together, you realize you have something more than just one random person, or let's say, as you said, thousands of random people claiming to be the Messiah. And we go, well, thousands of people claim to be the Messiah, so what? Exactly. But in this case, it is unique. That's why we disregard all of those cases, and those guys are nameless figures. But we've got to take this claim rather seriously. So, and I'm not saying jump to belief. I'm not saying, uh, you know, just stop questioning and just jump and believe whatever I'm saying this ought to be scrutinized and start taking it more seriously in that sense. I hope you see what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we should always take the argument seriously. I think it's a really
Yeah,
important part of the debate to not trivialize the opposing position. It's like what was it? Uh, if you only know your own side of the issue, you know little of that. And John
right.
Stuart Mill said something like, "It is imperative to all forms of truth and human understanding that if dissidents to all commonly held truths do not exist, we must invent them and impart unto them the strongest possible arguments a devil's advocate may conjure up." So I think you're absolutely right that we should take all of the arguments seriously. I think that's a really important part on both sides. And I think it's something atheists don't do enough. I think they trivialize the theist arguments too much.
And I think that what you said is true, but I also think on the Christian side that I can speak of, we don't take the atheist claims enough. And I've always said this when I speak, that I think atheists come up with good objections, but my personal thought is they have bad answers to those good questions. So I think the best thing to do would actually have Christianity scrutinized by an atheist. You ask all the right questions, and I think that in that sense, I think Christian tradition, at least since the rise of modernism, has been enriched by atheist skepticism and questioning. Thank God for the likes of David Hume and Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
So and that's at least the way I see it, because I want to take these questions seriously. And my faith, I mentioned in my debate with Paulo Gia that I nearly lost my faith twice. The two different occasions. And for me, genuinely considering the other side has been one of the things that I think that has helped me along. Because if I'm very dismissive, my faith is really going to be quite shallow. But if I'm genuinely considering what the other side has to say, and I think that's the way we actually go deeper in our own faith, strengthened by, as we have iron sharpens iron, going deeper in our own faith. And I think, yeah, sure, both atheists and Christians could do that as well. And I really appreciate, that, at least that's the way I perceive this conversation as well. We've both been very open to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've enjoyed it a lot too. So, to the last topic we should go into is the problem of suffering. So, from my position, the it's not possible for there to be an all good, all powerful being who creates a world where we suffer involuntarily. For me, that's essentially shows that there can't be the Christian God, because if there was an all good, all powerful God, he would have essentially given us the option to go to a universe of his design or a universe without all of the suffering. We should have been able to choose. But we don't have that choice. So it seems to me God is forcing us into this world without our consent, which is like by definition slavery and by definition immoral.
Right. So I think there's quite a few areas that I would love to discuss with you. I'm not quite sure we have enough time. Slavery is one of those issues that I think is such a hot topic. Okay, but I'll leave the slavery issue aside. Just deal with the problem of suffering first. But if we do have time, we really should deal with the issue of slavery, because I actually believe the Bible supports slavery. And I know most Christians would actually say, no, that's a misunderstanding. I actually think the Bible condones slavery. And if I believe that the Bible is the word of God, I'm actually obligated to believe everything it says and not pick and choose. Right? You have to be consistent. Otherwise, you appear to be a hypocrite. So, but I'll define slavery a bit later if that opportunity emerges. Clearly, not the American slave trade. That's not what I have in mind. Clearly, not sex trafficking or anything like that. But getting back to the issue of involuntary suffering, I think that one of the arguments that Scripture gives against this. I'm going to go back to this because this is a theological question. One of the arguments that the Scripture gives is that Paul's argument in Romans 9, where basically the claim is, who can resist God's will? I mean, if God has all these things decreed, who can resist his will? Paul's response is actually quite brutal. His response is, who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Does not the potter have the right to make a clay in any way he so desires? And I think that would be kind of my response, Tom. And I don't expect it to be popular. I expect my answer to be ridiculed. I expect my answer to be mocked. Just totally expected. But I think if we genuinely believe that we are God's creatures, if we do believe that there is a God who created us, then he jolly well has a right to do with his creatures whatever he wants. And really, if anything, the creature does not have any right, autonomous right, independent of what the creator gives to them. So the idea that that the creator has somehow got to get the permission of his created beings in order to do anything seems very strange to me, both on a philosophical level and on a theological level. Rather, it seems to me that the God of the Bible creates the world, and I would think God is responsible for a lot of evil in this world. I would say that, and I would go so far as to say that God is responsible for a lot of evil in this world. And I don't think that the weak free will defense kind of renders God guilt free. I think that is really a weak argument, but I hold to a greater good defense where I believe that God decreased the evils in the world for a greater good. Sure, I will not be able to see that now, and for me, the greatest example of that, Tom, has been in the death and crucifixion of Jesus. For me, that is the single most greatest evil the world has ever committed. If Jesus was God, the very God who created the world, then spitting at him, slapping him, kicking him, hanging him naked on a cross after scourging him would be the greatest evil the world has ever seen. But in the Christian worldview, that is the greatest act of good as well. It was the spitting, the slapping, the kicking, and ultimately the flogging and the nailing on the cross that brings about salvation to all who believe, according to my worldview. So to me, God can take the greatest act of evil and turn it into the greatest act of good. He decreed the evil. Jesus clearly said in Luke 22:22, the Son of Man will go as it has been decreed. But it's that amazing ability, like what Joseph says in Genesis 50:20, you meant evil against me, but God can turn it for good. That seems to be the case. So God brings about this evil in this world. It's a mess for the creatures that are in suffering. We are just told to weep with those who weep. Sometimes we don't understand why this happens because God could. I mean, the Bible says that he says to Jesus, you are my son whom I love. In you I'm well pleased. Next minute, he's condemning Jesus to go and he's telling Jesus to go and die that brutal death. So for me, as a Christian who affirms the biblical truths, I see a compatibility with saying that God could love something and also someone rather, and then command someone to go through suffering. For me, those things can be actually held, and they're not in any way in conflict with the Christian God. But I would really love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think that that's obviously immoral. Like if someone creates you, even if God created me and has all powerful and I am his creation, I don't think that gives him the right to do anything he wants to me. To me, I would disagree with that fundamentally. That seems really, really immoral. It seems exactly like slavery. But I wanted to give you a chance to define slavery because you said slavery was that the Bible condones slavery, and a lot of people would try and like quote mine you on that and say that you're advocating for
Yes.
slavery. So I want to give you a chance to define what you mean by slavery because I don't want people to strawman your position there.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for that, Tom. Yeah. So I'm definitely not advocating for slavery, but what I believe is that when the Bible condones slavery, number one, it condemns anyone who holds another person captive ought to be put to death. Meaning any slave trader would have to be killed by the Mosaic standards. Now, I'm strongly a proponent of the separation between church and state. I don't think that the church has ever been a force for good. I think that every time the church has tried to bring heaven and on earth, it has inevitably produced hell. So I'm for completely a separation of church and state. But what I'm saying here is under the Mosaic principle, which is a national legal system for the Jewish people at that period of time, not today, at that period of time, slavery was the equivalent of either being a captive in war, where basically they were put to forced labor, or number two, you had a debt that you couldn't pay. You voluntarily sold yourself into slavery. And even then, at a particular period, I think was it every 7 years or every 50 years? I need to go back and check that. The year of Jubilee, you will have to be set free. In fact, the Mosaic law has this special clause which says if when you set them free, the person really doesn't want to be set free, then you've got to do this, to ensure that this happens. So it seems to me that my understanding of it is that in the Old Testament, people sold themselves to slavery. It's the equivalent of going to a restaurant and saying, I ordered the food and I don't have the money to pay for it. I go behind and do the dishes. That for me is an idea of a biblical slavery that is there. So I don't think the Bible condemns slavery. In fact, I think just declaring bankrupt and not paying your debts is rather for me a deprivation of good. And rather, if let's say I owe someone money, the most noble thing I could do is to basically offer to work for that person at least until I can compensate him. So my idea of slavery is something that is more voluntary, and I don't somehow think the idea of prison is good. I think the idea of prison is where you lock people up being funded by the state and they don't contribute anything back to society really is no use. So this is what I mean when I talk about slavery. It is not the American slave trade. It is not advocating for slavery today and just justifying it in the Mosaic context. And I'm glad, so thankful that you gave me an opportunity to clarify that. But I only say that in the context of when you say that slavery is always wrong, biblically, God permits certain kind of slavery, at least, that when people voluntarily do this and all that. But I guess your argument, as you mentioned earlier, Tom, is that this is involuntary, right?
Right, like you said anyone who holds someone captive against their will should be put to death. So isn't
Yes.
God doing that to us when He puts us in this world without our consent?
See, the reason why anyone who holds anyone captive will be put to death is because you don't have a right to do that to another human being. But you see, when it comes to God, He owns every one of us. We are His. We breathe His air. The body that we create, if He's creator, really belongs to Him. Okay, in a sense, the question that is left to be asked is what really is ours? What is mine that it wasn't first His? So once I think, and again, I hope you realize that I'm assuming a Christian worldview here. So naturally, someone who is atheistic is going to look at this and say, this makes no sense. But assuming that I believe in a God, then the right thing for me to do is to really assume that God has a right to do with me whatever He jolly well pleases to do. And I think for you, you would say that's immoral. But when you say it's immoral, let me just explain why I think that may not be immoral in my understanding. And that's I'll use this illustration that I've used in a debate before. It's of a blunt knife. Okay, if you take a blunt knife, and you basically it's a bad knife, right? No one buys a blunt knife. And if you ask the question, why is the blunt knife bad? The answer is because it fails its purpose. It can cut. So for me, the ability of an object to fulfill or a person to fulfill their purpose or to fail their purpose is really what determines whether they are good or bad. If we fulfill the purpose for which we were created, we are good. If we fail that purpose, we are bad. And that's where the Hebrew word sin, kata, actually means to fall short of something. And I would argue it's purpose. But notice, Tom, that purpose can only be derived from a maker. A knife in this illustration, I know the illustration has problems, but the knife in this illustration cannot make its own purpose. Its purpose is made by the maker. The maker makes it for a particular intention, particular purpose. If it fulfills its purpose, it's a good knife. If it fails its purpose, it's a bad knife. For me, I think creation has a purpose. God created it for a particular purpose. It's not immoral of God to expect them to fulfill up to His purpose of creation. When you say it is immoral, Tom, I suspect what you may be saying, I hope you correct me if I'm wrong. I suspect what you may be saying is, according to my purpose, which I determine autonomously for my own life, it doesn't fulfill that. I didn't ask to be created. Therefore, God is immoral. Sure, by that standard, I would agree God is immoral. But again, I believe that morality is tied to the divine purpose, not our own. So that's where I think the difference between us two.
Right. I wrote a model of objective morality, so it's a little more complicated than that. But I don't think we have time to go into that in detail. But yeah, from my definition of slavery is when one person is owned by another. And so when you say that we're property of God, that would be slavery to me, and that would just be objectively immoral. So to me, that is just immediately, if someone says determines your purpose and you don't get to determine your purpose, that is slavery, and that's bad. Like always, that's bad.
I'm just curious. I mean, I'm sure you've been asked this question a million times. Well, why would you say that's bad in your view, in your worldview?
Well, that goes into how I define morality is the lack of the imposition lack of involuntary impositions of will, which I believe is the fundamental principle describing what the best of all possible worlds would be like, and that's the grounds of what my objective morality is based on.
So when you say the best of all possible worlds, you would agree with me that you are defining based on what you think it ought to be, right?
No,
Because
defining
when you
based
say
off what every individual gets to define for themselves, essentially.
okay, yeah. So if every individual defines it for themselves, then you're saying best relative to creation, I presume, right? Everyone,
Uh, I'm not sure what you mean by creation, but yes, best for everyone.
creatures. I mean, yeah, okay. It's assuming a creator. I get what you mean. But what I'm simply saying is when you say it is best, you're talking about every human being defining what is best based on for them, right?
Right, right.
No suffering, for example.
Yes, if that's what they wanted. So I would say that the best is that they aren't owned by someone else, so they have autonomy and they get to define for themselves what is the best.
Right. And whereas where I'm coming from, I'm saying what is best is really depends on the intentionality of the maker. So, for example, I've used this illustration before. The best genes really depends on who is making the genes, right? If my parents are a little bit more conservative, and by American standards, really conservative because we're already Asian. So, uh, so if you have a ripped jeans in my house, that would be considered a really bad jeans, right? It's got holes in it. But if the designer was simply a hipster, and that was a means of him expressing his hipsterness, that wouldn't be a bad jeans. That would be the best jeans because that would express his individuality. So it really is subjective depending on who is the maker, I think, that gets to decide what is best and what is based on his intentionality. I don't think uh, that is something that to be determined by the ones being made. But having said that, Tom, I really would love to read your paper. If you could get that to me, I would really love to. By the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I'm actually speaking on that exact same topic, the problem of evil tonight
Oh yeah,
in Malaysia in a few time. Yeah, so that's actually a topic I've just prepared for. So I would love to read your paper and to actually, if possible, get my students to interact with it.
absolutely. I'll send you the link. Is your upcoming debate going to be broadcast on YouTube, or can we watch that, or is that going to be private?
No, it's a lecture.
Oh, it's a lecture.
Yeah,
All right.
tonight. It's a lecture tonight on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you that. Put it into a video so it's easier for people to watch. Would you mind asking some or answering some questions from the Q&A from my audience?
Sure, of course. I would love to.
All right, so here's one. What does Sam think of the reprobate doctrine in the Bible? What is a reprobate? From Iron
A
Charioteer.
reprobate?
Retrobate or reprobate.
Right. Okay. If he's saying reprobate, I mean, I assume he's talking about someone who is doomed to hell.
I think
What is
so.
my view of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a general question. I'm not quite sure if you could specify what you mean in what respect. So, but in general, I don't believe God predestines anyone to hell. If that's what the question is, and I believe that sinners are already headed to hell. God simply picks who He saves. Okay, that's my view. But if you could maybe specify, I'd be happy to
All
go
right,
a
I'll
bit deeper.
check. I'll check to make sure if he does specify. So here's another one from Ronald Mindonga. Wasn't the torture of Jesus part of God's plan?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I mean that's been the view. It's part of God's plan all along. Yeah.
All right. And so here's one from Ray Rez. He asks, "You said that God is responsible for some evil. Could you
Yes.
talk about that a little bit?"
Okay. Take for example. Take for example. Uh, yeah, I think I gave an example of that in my talk about when it came to about Jesus' death. When about Jesus' death, that would be an example of an evil that God has decreed. Or to to give another example for that, I'm trying to. Um, I mean, I believe that every act of evil that happens in the world, I'm just struggling to find an particular example to zero in on. But I believe every act of evil that happens in the world is a result of God's foreknowledge and that God determined it in some sense. So I don't think God gets off the hook, and I don't. That's because I believe in a completely sovereign God. I don't think that anything happens uh, without God decreeing it, if that makes sense. So that would apply to every evil that actually has ever happened. I'm just struggling to give an illustration of what I mean. But if you want, I'll give you a biblical illustration. Say Joseph going into slavery, being sold into slavery. That was part of God's plan. Was it God's plan and decree that Joseph goes into the mistreatment, the ill treatment that he's been through? Absolutely. In fact, the funny thing is, God gave him the dream that his brothers would rule. He would rule over his brothers, knowing full well that dream would cause him to be rejected by them, pushed away into Egypt as a slave, through which that dream would actually get fulfilled. So that's an example of God decreeing evil again. And I think the Bible is quite clear that God, actively decrees evil. Isaiah 45:7 touches on that. Lamentations 3:38 touches on that. Luke 22:22, as I mentioned, implies that. And of course, Ephesians 1:11 says that all things are decreed, that God predestines everything according to the counsel of his will. So I think nothing has escaped from him.
All right, interesting. Yeah, that was actually brought up a couple of times, asking you. That's a unique position. Most people don't say that God is responsible for evil, so it's interesting. That is a unique position that you hold that I'm very interested in. I'd definitely like to learn more about that at some time.
Sure thing.
So here's the question: the Q source scholars say the passage about the parable of the adulteress wasn't in the original manuscripts. Does he recognize this passage about the adulteress as being original? The part
You're,
where
you're talking about
where he
you,
bends
you're
down into the
speaking.
sand and say, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone."
Right. Yeah, you're talking about John chapter 8, verse 1 to 11, and it's called the pericope adultery. Actually, no, that's John chapter 7, the last verse, all the way until 8:11. I'm sorry I have to move a bit because phone is battery is getting really low. Uh, I've only got 3% left. So, but just plug the charger on. Okay, it's just gone down to 2%. So this may be the last question that I answer. But yeah, I would say it's not part of the original manuscripts. It's not part. Sorry, my phone has just gone to 1%.
That's all right.
It's not part of the original manuscripts, is my answer.
All right. So last question: uh, torturing Jesus was a part of God's plan. Then why did you say it was the worst thing that ever happened? Wouldn't that be God's fault?
I'm sorry, my phone has gone to zero.
Uh,
Okay. I'm sorry if I get cut off when I'm answering this one. It's the batteries have just gone out really quickly. So could you repeat that question again?
if Jesus being tortured was the worst thing that happened, and it was a part of God's plan, doesn't that mean it's God's fault? God did the worst thing that could ever happen.
Certainly, I think that would fit in into what I just mentioned earlier about God decreeing the evil in the world and bringing it for good. So it's not God's fault because God didn't mean it for evil. I think it's only God's fault if God meant it only in that the end result was evil. But I think God was using it to bring about good.
Awesome.
So yeah, so that's my response. So every time I believe that God is responsible for evil, He does so to bring about good. So that's a position I hold to.
All right. Well, I want to thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I want to let you go before your phone runs out. So,
Thank you so much, Tom. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and thank you for your viewers as well.
absolutely. Talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.